Well, good morning. First, I'd like to start this webinar by acknowledgement of First Peoples. We have participants from all around the world at this webinar, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging First Peoples from all our countries and pay respects to them. We honour their wisdom and their stewardship of traditional lands and customs which enrich us all. So welcome to you all. I'm Simon Corden. I'm a Commissioner at the Victorian Essential Services Commission and the Chair of NRCoP's National Regulator Community of Practice. We're up to our 7th webinar now since the lockdown began, and we're delighted with the number of people registering for these, including from jurisdictions we're never able to reach with face-to-face events. Also people in regional areas and people working part-time, so it's been a great success. Even when we are able to get back to live events, the National Regulator Community of Practice will continue running a webinar program because obviously they're meeting a need. So please use the opportunity in the evaluation survey to share your ideas about future topics. It's my very pleasant duty to introduce our speakers today. Many of you will already know the work of Professor Cary Coglianese and his colleagues at the Penn program on regulation, so I won't take up too much time reading his stellar CV. I'll just let our moderator person let you see Cary. So Cary's most recent book on regulator excellence has influenced regulators around the world, including in Australia. And indeed, our second speaker, Kate Maddern, is here to tell us how this framework was adopted in reforming a Victorian regulator of public transport. I'm also going to recommend his work on the perennial question of does regulation kill jobs, which have ruined many dinner parties for you at various times, I'm sure, when you admit what you do for a living. You'll be able to find Cary's slide presentation on the NRCoP Regulators website under resources/regulatory challenges. As a spoiler alert, there's no simple answer to that question. So Cary was the keynote speaker at the 2016 annual NRCoP National Regulator Community of Practice Forum, and he spoke on regulator excellence then. And we've had many requests to bring him back down under, but due to the miracles of technology, not to mention Cary's willingness to present a webinar at 7 p.m. on a Monday night, we have the honour of having his presence today. Our second speaker is Kate Maddern. You should be able to see Kate now. Kate is currently director.
Hi, Simon.
Hi, Kate. Good to see you. Kate is currently the director of the Victorian Disability Workers Commission and a long-standing and highly valued member of the National Regulator Community of Practice Steering Committee. Today's commentary on the RegX framework, she's going to be drawing on one of her previous regulatory lives when she was the director of the Victorian Public Transport Regulatory Operations, where she applied the lessons from the presentation that Cary provided in 2016 and the insights from the book that he produced. So before we get started, while Cary's getting ready to put up his slides, we're going to use Slido to do a couple of Slido polls to just get a baseline of how people think their regulator is going in terms of excellence. So for anyone who missed the opening announcement, if you put Slido on your browser, on your phone and enter hashtag RegX, when today's event comes up, choose polls on the right-hand side of the screen, and then you can answer the first poll question. And what we're interested in finding out is how would you describe the maturity of your regulator? Do you think it's fully mature, partially mature, you're sort of neutral, relatively immature, or just beginning the journey to maturity? So where do you think your regulator is on that sort of maturity spectrum? So if we can get people to vote on that, and the votes are coming in. We're going to leave that poll open till towards the end of the webinar when we'll talk through what the results are. So can people keep, we've got about 30 people have responded. 35, 41. Okay, and we're going to do a second poll. So after you've responded that, there's a second poll that will come up, which will ask you about what do you think are the main barriers to achieving regulatory excellence. And this is one where you can choose more than one option. So is it the adequate resources? Is it organisational culture? Is it availability of training? inappropriate or outdated legislation? Is it the leadership of your organisation is holding you back? Is it the risk appetite or regulatory posture? So as I said, we'll keep that poll open during the course of the webinar, and we'll run back to let you hear the results at the end of towards the end of the webinar. So now I'll hand over to Cary, who will run through his presentation. Thank you, Cary.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. It's a delight to be with everybody today. I'm going to highlight my slides and be delighted to talk with you today about journey to regulatory excellence. My remarks, I should say, are oriented primarily to those of you who are listening who are regulators, who work for a regulatory organization, but I think they're also of interest to and important for the public, anybody who's interested in regulation. And I think if I had to boil down what I'm going to say in a nutshell, first, regulation is vital and regulatory excellence is hard. Okay, now for those of you who are regulators, you are saying, well, I knew that already. But what I also want to do is suggest that it's maybe even harder than you think, that regulatory excellence is multifaceted, but it's also manageable. What it comes down to ultimately are people. Regulatory excellence is ultimately people excellence. Now, let me just start by highlighting a real truth about regulation and the performance of regulatory systems. And this truth is that when regulation fails, it's highly visible to the public. Water starts coming out of faucets that's dirty. Explosions occur. People can't get their money out of the bank. These are massive regulatory failures that everybody is aware of. But there's an asymmetry about the performance of a regulatory system. The asymmetry is that as much as the regulatory failures are visible, highly visible, regulatory success is much harder to see. What does regulatory success look like? Well, this slide is blank, not because I'm suggesting there isn't regulatory success, but rather because when a regulatory system is successful, people don't notice it. Systems perform the way they're supposed to perform. Airplanes take off that are without crashing. People can go to their banks and take out their money. And little credit goes to the regulator when things are working well. It's just the way things are supposed to be. But massive blame will occur and accrue to the regulator when things don't go well. Now, I do think it is possible to see that regulatory quality really does matter. It's not really as opaque as this. In fact, one way you can see it is by looking at a common area of regulation across different countries, building regulation. And what I have here are story of 3 earthquakes, one in 2015 in Nepal, which resulted in 9,000 deaths and 20,000 injuries and massive property damage. Why? Because the buildings were built before modern regulatory codes for safe construction of buildings and quality construction. Just 2 years later, an earthquake of roughly the same magnitude strikes near Mexico City. Mexico City has modern building codes, only 361 deaths and 6,000 injuries. But Mexico City doesn't have consistent enforcement of those codes. Third earthquake occurs a year later in and near Anchorage, Alaska, in the US. No deaths, no injuries. People are not even fazed by this occurring. One of the biggest pieces of damage is a roof that that actually gave way. But why was Alaska spared? Well, not because the earthquake was any less serious. It was actually closer to the major city than the other two earthquakes, but rather because Alaska suffered a very serious earthquake in 1964, and then has made sure that they upgraded their building regulations since, and they have had robust and consistent enforcement. Regulation can work, and the challenge for regulatory excellence is to make it work. And it can work. It does work. Even when we don't see it, it is working. Now, with that said, a few years ago, we embarked on a project to try to identify what are the characteristics of an excellent regulator. And I went around and talked with folks in a wide variety of regulatory institutions themselves. And in the years since, I've been speaking about and talking with a lot of regulators from around the world. I also have spent time talking to those folks who are regulated and those folks in the community who are affected by regulation. And I've asked them, what do you think makes for an excellent regulator? And I will tell you this, that in all of these conversations, I have heard just about every positive adjective, except maybe for physical beauty or smell or something like that, that doesn't apply, but almost any other positive adjective that one could think of applied to a regulator. In fact, a study that a colleague of mine and I did, and we looked around the world at various academic publications, government publications about what makes for a high quality regulator. And then we created this word graph. The larger the word, the more frequently these qualities emerged across all of these reports. And as you can see, even this distillation has a tremendous variety of different adjectives that one could use to describe a regulator. And we found that some of these adjectives people use to describe what they thought, what we think of as sort of the traits of a regulator, their ongoing, consistent qualities. Maybe one might call it their organizational culture. Others use these adjectives to describe the actions that regulators take. And others still use these adjectives to describe the outcomes. And there are three different ways of thinking about what an excellent regulator is. Is a regulator excellent because of what it does, what it is, or what it achieves? And I think the answer in some sense is yes. It's to all of those things. But with so many different adjectives, how can we make some progress in managing regulatory organizations with excellence in mind? Because if one tries to be all things to all people, that won't be an excellent regulator, and it's not even really possible. So to try to distill down and get to the essence of regulatory excellence, I actually asked my team to step back and let's think about excellence in other domains. For example, we asked, what is it that makes for an excellent cellist, like Yo-Yo Ma? Yo-Yo Ma, accomplished, world-class, world-renowned musician. Everybody knows who Yo-Yo Ma is. Well, you know, what makes Yo-Yo Ma excellent? Well, part of it is the same sorts of ways of looking at excellence can apply to a musician. Does this musician have the traits of an excellent musician? Does this musician engage in the actions that an excellent musician takes? Does this musician actually achieve the outcomes of high quality music? And in fact, I think that is indeed what makes Yo-Yo Ma excellent. There is something about the qualities that he has as a person, his innate talent, his internal capacities, his intelligence. He's someone I think who went to Harvard when he was 16 years old. A tremendously bright person. So those inner qualities are there. But on the other hand, he also has the skills. He knows how to take the actions. He knows how to use his fingers to make beautiful music. And really, it's that last third feature that I think sometimes we might forget, is that an excellent regulator an excellent musician, also is evoking something in the audience. It's that engagement with us and the way Yo-Yo Ma makes us feel. Now, having thought through what excellence means for a musician, I want to actually suggest that the work that regulators are doing is more difficult than what even Yo-Yo Ma faces as a challenge to play the cello well. I mean, first of all, Yo-Yo Ma often performs in solo, and regulators are working in an organization. They are, it's a collectivity. And in a regulatory organization, by the way, is nested within a larger system of governance. And it may be that, if others within that government are not projecting excellence, it's difficult for the regulator to be excellent. I think that there's something to be said for why our Food and Drug Administration, our Centers for Disease Control, took so long to move forward with adequate testing and approval of testing of the coronavirus, in part because they were nested within a larger administration with a president who, for several months starting in January, didn't want to acknowledge that the U.S. could be affected by a viral pandemic. He wanted to just deny it, and that's got to have certainly have affected the performance of those regulatory agencies. So that's one thing that makes being a regulator more difficult. The other is that you're operating in a dynamic environment. First of all, it's an environment in which some businesses that are regulated don't want to be regulated, or they want to achieve their business goals anyway without either being caught or maybe by technically complying with the regulation but not achieving the outcome that the regulator is aiming for. So imagine Yo-Yo Ma operating the cello and the cello moving around, trying to escape Yo-Yo Ma's bow. That's sort of what a regulator is facing with business. Plus, the whole climate is changing. Technology is changing. The industry is in flux. Society itself and its expectations are in flux. So it's very difficult to be a regulator, but there is a way of, I think, distilling this down and making some sense of it and moving forward and really getting some focus. And that is through what I call RegX, or the molecule of regulatory excellence. I want to see a regulatory excellence is comprising three main atoms of excellence. Stellar competence, and that's the one that most regulators think of immediately. We've got to do our jobs well, absolutely. That's part of regulatory excellence, but so too is always acting with the utmost integrity. That is, making sure your organization is firmly committed to advancing public value, to complying with its legal mission, to operating as a responsible actor. And lastly, empathic engagement. A regulator doesn't sit off in a closet and get its work done. Can't stay too socially distant and be an effective regulator. You have to engage, and any good regulator is going to have some level of competence and integrity and engagement. But an excellent regulator has to have these at a highly consistent level. The same way the difference between a good tennis player and an excellent tennis player. An excellent tennis player has consistency, getting that ball over the net on a consistent basis. So that's why the adjectives utmost, stellar, and empathic are all there to remind you that you have to do more. Now, within each of these atoms of excellence, just like any real atom is comprised of electrons and protons and so forth, we have various tenets. And I want to highlight each of these within each of them. Stellar competence, as I said, is I think what most people naturally look to. I'm a traffic safety regulator. Well, my job is to make sure that people are safe on the roads. Okay, that's absolutely important. And we see in the relative performance between the US and New Zealand, and here I'm drawing on a diagram from a recent essay in the Regulatory Review by a colleague, Richard Parker at the University of Connecticut, where he traces out the cumulative deaths in the US, where we're now over 115,000 deaths from COVID-19, and the remarkable success that New Zealand has had in preventing that kind of, quite frankly, just human tragedy and travesty. And how did that come about? Through these key tenets: analytic capability, having the data, having testing, instrumental capacity, having the resources, having the ability to communicate effectively. These are all parts of the instrumental capacity that a stellar, competent regulator has. And then, of course, high performance, actually bringing down the cases, making the country coronavirus free. That's stellar competence. Okay, and I think this is the thing that everybody can see quite easily, but also, as I say, integrity matters. We've seen a range of regulatory agencies not being able to get much done. Especially early in the Trump administration, the Environmental Protection Agency was just mired in scandals because of the poor judgment of the EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, facing 13 federal investigations and ultimately resigning under a cloud of scandals. Well, during that time, the EPA really didn't accomplish much. Now, that may be fine for those in the Trump administration, didn't want it to do much, I suppose, but they did want to change some rules at least. And by and large, Scott Pruitt was completely ineffective at that. And many of the actions that they did take were overturned in the court. EPA usually wins when it goes to court. And during the Trump administration, they've lost time and time again, almost all of their cases. Now, a new EPA administrator is in, who is not under the cloud of ethics scandals, who's more aware of the need to comply with the law, to respect the role, and accomplishing more for at least the agenda that this administration has. Finally, I want to talk about empathic engagement, because I think this is the part of the regulator's task that is often the least immediate. It's not immediate right now to far too many police officers, which are certainly a type of agency, an enforcement agency that we can see in all of our societies. And here in the US, far too many of our police officers think about their jobs in terms of control and not in terms of empathic engagement. Just the other day, even after the outpouring of protest around our country and around the world over the brutal killing of George Floyd, we have another police killing, Rayshard Brooks, a Black American who was drunk, asleep in a car at a Wendy's restaurant in Atlanta, gets killed, shot twice in the back by a police officer. Now, that's not empathic engagement. That's not trying to say, let's get you an Uber and get you home safely. We need to remember that when we don't have empathic engagement, it actually undermines our ability as regulators. I'm reminded of a book written by Bob Kagan and Gene Bardak many years ago called Going by the Book: The Problem of Regulatory Unreasonableness. And one of their main messages was that when regulators are not sufficiently reasonable in their engagement with the public, it creates a backlash and a resistance to the regulator and the regulator's purpose. Clearly, we have that going on in the US with our police force, and we need more empathy too. All right, so these are the qualities, the multifaceted nature of regulatory excellence. How do we get there? Well, the way I think about it is that the regulator is trying to work a causal chain, starting with the regulator as an organization, then moving to the actions that it takes. Those actions are supposed to and should be affecting the behavior of the regulated firms, which then should be leading to the substantive outcomes that we care about, such as reduced accidents, let's say, in chemical facilities. A chemical safety regulator is organizing, takes actions to impose rules and to enforce those rules, to engage and educate, to guide and shape the behavior of chemical companies so that there are fewer accidents. Behavior leads to substantive outcomes. But you know, there's also an important additional set of outcomes, what I call perceptual outcomes. This is the legitimacy, the trust that the public has in the regulator, the faith. This is just as important because if we undermine faith in the system and undermine the legitimacy of the regulator, it's going to be very hard to shape behavior. Regulators rarely can be everywhere all the time. So much compliance is really fundamentally voluntary. You have to protect the legitimacy. Now, how do you do all this? Well, if you look, these two boxes are where it's all at. If you're in a regulatory organization, this is what you can control, your organization and the actions that it takes. And as you can see, there's four parts there to the key parts to regulatory excellence that I think are important to highlight within the organization and within the actions that it takes. So within the organization, the people matter, the mission, the resources, the human capital, the autonomy, the culture have to be committed to regulatory excellence. But then the actions that you take have to be aiming at the right priorities, based upon evidence, based upon understanding of the risks. You have to go about then taking actions to solve those problems, creating rules, applying rules, educating, responding to incidents, and measuring and evaluating. That's all part of problem solving. And finally, the fourth P, I'm from Penn, so I have a lot of P's here. The fourth P is the public, reaching out with empathy, responsiveness, listening, being even-handed. Okay, that's critical. And then finally, what you can think about in your own organizations is to put that tenets of regulatory excellence, the three atoms that make up the molecule on the left here, the first column, utmost integrity, empathic engagement, and stellar competence, and each of the tenets behind them. And then you can map out your regulatory model, starting with the organization, its actions, and then the performance, the three types of things you're trying to change: behavior and perceptual outcomes, and then the substantive outcomes. And you can map out then, how are you doing? How is your organization faring in terms of its mission, its resources, with respect to integrity, with respect to engagement, with respect to competence? My guess is that many organizations invest much more resources and they define their mission much more frequently in terms of competence. We want to have safe foods. We want to have safe drugs. Absolutely important, should never diminish that emphasis, but expand it to see that you are actually needing to do much more than that. You have to maintain the integrity to the organization. You have to remain empathic in your engagement with the public. Ultimately, in the end, what really counts for regulatory excellence is what I call people excellence. Leadership matters. Training matters. Adequate pay matters, and resources for the people who you employ. You know, technology is increasingly important to all organizations and to regulators too. And I've done a lot of work on how regulators need to start thinking about using artificial intelligence, for example. There's no question about that. But fundamentally, regulation is a relational enterprise, and regulatory excellence starts with people excellence. People who have the utmost integrity, who display stellar competence, and people who are empathic in their engagement with others. Thank you very much.
So over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Simon. And thanks, Cary. Today, I'm going to talk about how I used regulatory excellence framework in reforming a Transport Department regulator in Victoria from late 2016. So I'll just talk a little bit about the context for reform first. The Public Transport Regulatory Operations Branch was a department regulator that managed the public transport infringement cycle and also regulated the conduct of authorised officers. At the time, stakeholders had raised significant concerns and there'd been a loss of public confidence about the fairness of some aspects of the public transport infringement system. This had been reflected in investigations and commentary, including from the Public Transport Ombudsman and the Victorian Ombudsman. And that culminated, excuse me, in May 2016 with both a department review and an Ombudsman's report being released at the same time. I started working with the regulator later that year, and my task was reforming the regulator in that context. So, as Cary's just covered, his framework of regulatory excellence has three key core, I used attributes rather than atoms, but I'll just go through them again. So if you only remember three things by the end of our talk today, hopefully it's those three. So first, utmost integrity, that an excellent regulator consistently holds itself to the highest standards of integrity. This particularly includes fidelity to the law, and both the laws, the regulators responsible for enforcing, but also other laws that apply to the regulator. Secondly, empathic engagement. An excellent regulator engages empathically with all segments of society when making its decisions and exercising authority. And finally, stellar competence. An excellent regulator demonstrates consistently stellar competence by using its resources to maximise its public value. So what did we do? So we undertook a range of reforms that focused across all of these three core attributes. So we improved integrity. We did this by improving the systems and processes within the regulator, including better processes for exercising discretion. This included, importantly, clearer assessment criteria for when the regulator issued warnings or fines for ticketing offences, allowing the more systematic use of warnings. In our work, we engaged empathically. We listened and we gave reasons in a clear, plain English way, and we removed vulnerable people from the infringement cycle earlier. Finally, we strengthened competence and we supported improved staff capability by investing in training, including integrity training, privacy training, governance training, investigations training, and also operational training in the new systems and processes for the regulator. So how do we apply regulatory excellence across these reforms? Well, we adapted Cary's framework and created a narrative reform that was linked to regulatory excellence, and there was a particularly strong emphasis on empathic engagement. We summarised the framework in simple language and we had it on a page, and all our staff had a copy of regulatory excellence on a page. We illustrated that with examples, so examples of outcomes that may not have been consistent, say with empathic engagement, so that people understood what we were talking about. What was really important, it was that we also included the important message that you might still have the same regulatory decision, but empathic engagement means people better understand and learn, so then hopefully change their behaviour in the future. We also lived and celebrated regulatory excellence. We use that language regularly. We recognised and celebrated achievements and improvements, including in leadership team meetings and monthly staff morning teas, where we'd highlight some of the achievements over the previous month. We applied regulatory excellence across the business, from the strategy level, but also deep operational dives. What we did was we also involved staff in the reform. This helped to improve capability and engagement, but also helped us inform improvements. Sometimes the quietest person can be the most insightful if you can give them an opportunity to contribute in the right environment. Finally, we were curious. Why do we do this? It's a really powerful question in reform. So I'm just going to go through two quick examples of empathic engagement in practice. So this first example, after people receive an infringement notice for a ticketing offence, i.e. you're travelling without a ticket on public transport, many people seek to have that decision reviewed. So before the reforms, most people received a standard response that was difficult for most people to understand, using legal terms and referring to absolute liability. So I've just got an example of some of the wording up on the screen now. So what we did, we invested time in improving these response letters, particularly those that confirm the decision to issue the infringement, so therefore reject the review, to explain why, in clearer language, we are confirming the decision. So the second example, our focus was on vulnerable people with special circumstances. Now, according to the law, special circumstances applies when a person who, for various reasons, such as intellectual disability, drug addiction or homelessness, they're unable to understand or control conduct that constitutes an offence under the Act. So our reform was to ensure that vulnerable people with special circumstances were removed from the infringement cycle as early as possible. So to do this, the reforms considered each stage of the infringement cycle. So first, authorised officers were educated that they shouldn't report a person who has special circumstances. Sometimes authorised officers weren't sure, and so what we did was we added a new box onto their report form that was the maybe special circumstances form. So if they thought this person may have special circumstances but they weren't sure, they'd tick that box. Then when the reports came into the regulator to process, if we received a report that had that box ticked, before we issued an infringement notice, we wrote to the person asking if they had special circumstances, and if so, we told them who could help them, like a local community legal centre, and how to provide evidence so that an infringement would not be issued. If they provided that evidence, we never issued an infringement notice to that person. What we also did was later through the cycle, we spent more effort on assessing the evidence at the internal review stage of whether there were special circumstances, and also before going to court through the prosecution stage. The outcome of all of that was there were less people with special circumstances in the infringement cycle, which I frame this as empathic engagement, but it really covers all three of the attributes of regulatory excellence. Utmost integrity, fidelity to the law. The law says these people shouldn't be in the cycle in the first place. Empathic engagement, listening to people, listening to feedback from stakeholders, and stellar competence as a regulator, only regulating with appropriately. So what was the outcome of our reform? So over a period of about 15 months with the same resources, we reformed the regulator. At the time, we managed a significant increase in reports workload. It was up about 40%, the reports on non-compliance from authorised officers. We did that with improved timeliness and with more empathic engagement. Cary mentioned earlier about regulatory successes don't appear in the media, it's only regulatory failures. So our sense of achievement was that the complaints to the Public Transport Ombudsman declined by 30% in the 12 months to November 2017, and that further declined the following year. And that said to us, we were doing a really good job with stakeholders better understanding. So finally, my lessons for other regulators in regulatory excellence. You need to go beyond strategy. You need to do deep dives to embed it in the operations. You need to involve your staff in the journey and in those deep dives. Along the way, you need to live regulatory excellence and celebrate it, the wins and improvements along the journey, and always be curious. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you. A very interesting presentation from both Cary and Kate, setting out the framework that Cary did in 2016 and then how it's been applied in real life to a really challenging area of regulation. The first question that we'll ask Cary to answer is, we've had a lot of people have responded to, should regulators be working harder at communicating success, and if so, how? As Kate mentioned, it's hard to get a story of a regulatory success into the media. Have you got any suggestions on whether they need to work harder in that area, and if so, how they could achieve it, Cary?
I spent a fair amount of time in a report that's actually titled Listening, Learning, and Leading, and I just call attention to the title of the report because of what Kate just presented about being curious, which is really, I think, as I hear it, about learning, constantly trying to learn how to be better. And in that report, I have a section on evaluation. And a lot of regulators around the world that I talk to would like more credit for what they do. I get it. I certainly do get it. That asymmetry of blame is what you hear about more than the successes. I get it. But what I really urge in that report for people to think about are they going about the kind of exercise that Kate described and that other regulators are using this framework and then adapting it for their organization? Are they doing it to become excellent or to be able to show the world that they're excellent? And sometimes maybe they do need to do that. I mean, I think a regulator needs to be mindful of building credibility and a reputation for being an excellent regulator. Okay, but all this is by way of saying I think the motivation, first of all, matters. Is the motivation behind the question more of a self-interested, we're just not getting as much credit as we deserve? Or is it, wait a minute, we want to be strategic and we think that if we can get more good news stories out about our regulator, that we can be more effective? I'll give you a concrete example from the States just in the last couple of weeks. A police department that's gotten a lot of favorable press is across the river from Philadelphia in Camden, New Jersey. Camden, New Jersey had for many, many years been thought of as the murder capital of the United States, very high crime rate, and lots of tensions between the police and the community. In the last couple of weeks, while other departments are seeing the failures when police are killing innocent black men, when they're killing or attacking protesters with force, the Camden Police Department got press for marching with the protesters because they didn't want to support abusive policing practices either. So they joined in. They not only just took a knee symbolically for a few moments, but they marched along, arm in arm. There's sexual photos, and that's the kind of empathic engagement that not only celebrates a success, but it sends a message. So think about building success stories as part of an overall strategy that you can shape those perceptual outcomes. But you can do that just as much by, actually achieving success, that stellar competence and that utmost integrity. Because I tell you, quite frankly, if you don't pay attention to utmost integrity, you can go from being thought of and celebrated as an excellent regulator to one person in the organization bringing down the reputation and getting a lot of the news for some financial improprieties or other kinds of ethical shortcuts. So it's a difficult situation. Yes, try to find successes, celebrate successes. I think what I heard in Kate's presentation is you're celebrating successes internally too. And that's, if you're not doing that, that's easy to do, and you can start that right away. Getting that external publicity going to be a little bit harder, but do it for the right reasons.
Fantastic. So one of the other questions we've had, which is the most popular one, will there be copies of the slides available after this? So Kate and Cary's slides, we'll be putting them up on the ANZOG website shortly, so they'll be available, as will the YouTube video, within 2 weeks. As promised, we're going to take a quick break before we cut back to take some more questions. A quick break in the proceedings, because we know some people need to get away after about 45 minutes. So we should have up on the screen the calendar of future events, just to let you remind you that on the 30th of June, we've got another webinar on what would culturally responsive regulation of Aboriginal organisations look like, which I think is a particularly timely session that will be running on the 30th of June. And the 2 weeks after that, Inside Out, the pros and cons of independent versus departmental regulator, does it matter? We'll have Graham Samuel and Peter Shergold addressing that really important and interesting issue. So we've got 2 more scheduled at the moment, and there'll be more to come after that. Now we'll just have a quick look, for those of you who can stay on, we'll have a quick look at the poll results before we cut back to some additional questions. And I think Mark's going to be able to put the poll results up for us. So in terms of where people thought they were on the spectrum, 4% of the respondents thought that they've got a fully mature regulator. I'd love to work with you. The majority partially mature, 16% neutral, 12% relatively mature. Cary, what do you think you would get if you asked this question in the US? What sort of answer do you think you'd get to this question?
Well, obviously, it will depend a little bit on which regulator you're asking, right? We have hundreds of regulatory agencies just at the federal level alone. You know, some of our probably most progressive regulators, in some sense, are the newest ones. So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, at least under the Obama administration, was really making great strides. But I don't think they would say they were, fully mature, because they are there. I think there are others that would say they are fully mature, but they've become sclerotic and immovable and antiquated, if you will. I think having a sense of always being on the path towards excellence and toward growth and maturity is really where you want to be as an organization.
So the second question we asked was, after the maturity, was the barriers to maturity. And Mark, I'll just ask if you can switch across to that second poll. So organisational culture, by far the largest one there, after risk appetite, leadership, adequate resources, inappropriate and outdated legislation, and availability of training. So culture seems to be the critical one there. Kate, did you have any comment on that?
I'd probably agree that culture is hard, and changing culture is hard, but it is really fundamentally important. So I think for us, in reforming some of the systems and processes by engaging with staff to explain the why and work out the how was really important in turning that culture around.
That's interesting from your perspective. You mentioned, I think you highlighted in your presentation, that you achieved the change you did without additional resources. So it was really about changing how you used your existing capacity and capability rather than bringing in a whole lot of additional resources, which is obviously difficult at any time and is likely to be increasingly difficult coming out of the pandemic.
Simon, could I just interrupt for one moment on the organizational culture to just plug and let your audience know about a website we have called bestinclassregulator.org, and we have a paper specifically on organizational culture for regulators. that might be useful to people. And I think there's a real connection between that leadership answer and the organizational culture answer. You're not going to really change organizational culture unless you have the leadership in place committed to changing the culture. Even at that, it's going to be difficult.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Again, do you just want to repeat the source to look to?
So www.bestinclassregulator.org, and that's all one word, bestinclassregulator.org. And the final report from a regulatory excellence project that we conducted for a Canadian provincial regulator is there, but also a host of research papers, some that will be coming out in a forthcoming book. In fact, this one on organizational culture will be out in a forthcoming book of mine called The Regulator's Handbook. That will, this chapter, I highly recommend it. It really helps you understand what culture is within an organization and what are the levers to try to make the change.
Fantastic. Okay, that sounds like that would be a really interesting thing to report to read. Another question we've got here is, to what extent is the culture of the industry influencing the ability to achieve regulatory excellence? Might hand that to you, Cary, because you've looked across lots of different regulators and different industries.
Well, this is the thing about regulation, and one of the other reasons why it's harder than anything that Yo-Yo Ma ever tries to achieve, and not to at all diminish the extraordinary talent and excellence of Yo-Yo Ma, but the success of a regulator is dependent upon the regulated community. So what you see as a regulatory failure is action that's been taken by some regulated entity that's gone awry, right? So very much the culture of the regulated industry will affect how successful the regulator is. And it also affects how the regulator has to approach the industry. So we talked about how regulators and regulatory organizations can be partially mature or fully mature, maybe antiquated. Well, you have industries that are like this, some that are dynamic and changing in the technology area, digital space. This is changing rapidly, and the cultures in these organizations are sometimes very free-flowing, and that creates a need for a regulator to really be vigilant. You can't let up and just sort of think that things are, the rules are in place and that's it. On the other hand, there may be other cultures within industries that are, with respect to safety, for example, that are all set in their ways. And the challenge for the regulator is to try to jumpstart some cultural change within those staid industries and get them to think more carefully and more effectively about safety culture within their own firms. So yes, culture in the industry matters tremendously. As I said before, regulatory excellence and regulation in general is a relational enterprise, and you have to calibrate what you're doing as a regulator with not the customer, because the regulated industry is not really a customer, but with that industry. You're in a relationship with them, and you need to help shape that and move that forward. I sort of also sometimes think about regulation as a bit like a parent to a child. You can't really control that child, but you want to try to shape them, inspire them, and lead them along the way. And that's, but sometimes you do have to be firm as well.
Kate, you've worked across multiple areas of regulation. Did you have any comments on that in terms of the difference of culture and how that affects the ability to achieve excellence?
I think it is fundamentally important, culture, and I think being able to have staff in regulators understand what their objectives are and the tools that they have and use those tools appropriately and not lose sight of that, I think is really, really important. Okay, good. I had a question from Grant Pink. In your book, Cary, you refer to the importance of learning and measurement in achieving regulatory excellence. Can you point to any regulators which you think are undertaking useful
causal evaluation research?
Sure. Well, I think there's certainly causal evaluation research that is in any regulatory agency that's dealing with product approvals. So, for example, I'm in the U.S., the Food and Drug Administration, right? But I think the question probably is more toward the lines of, well, how about the causal relationship between what the regulator's doing, the rules, and the outcomes? And yes, I mean, I do think there is good research in some regulatory agencies in that regard. I mean, in the U.S., I think the leading federal agency in this regard is our auto safety regulator, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Now, the reason I think they've been effective at doing causal evaluation research and identifying which regulations are actually contributing to safe outcomes and which might be contributing to harm, as we found, for example, that airbags initially were designed in a crude way, and actually when they deployed, they were actually killing people, especially shorter people, women, children, because the crash test dummies initially were designed to be the size of the average male. But that's changed. We've reformed partly because of this attentiveness to causation. But the thing about the federal auto safety regulators is they have a large database. They're drawing in from automobile accidents from around the country. And not every regulator has the ability to tap into for doing statistical analysis that kind of large data set, especially regulators that are dealing with, say, low frequency but high consequence events, whether it's a bank failure or a nuclear reactor meltdown or a chemical facility explosion. In those cases, I think the regulators could do well to try to identify proxies or precursors and get data on those. In the aviation safety space in the US, we've created a near-miss database that has anonymous reporting by employees when they see an accident that could have happened, was close to happening, where they see violations of safety protocols and regulations. They can report that anonymously, and it creates a larger data set then. Fortunately, we don't have a lot of airplane crashes, right? But we do have, unfortunately, a lot of near misses that can be aggregated then and used for statistical analysis and causal research.
Okay, great. So just on 10 o'clock, thanks again to Cary for joining us from the US, and to Kate for joining us from Hampton, I believe. And all stay safe, and we look forward to your participation in the next webinar. Thank you very much.